Tensions are rising between the U.S. and Iran after an international watchdog confirmed the country wants to enrich uranium up to 20% purity. That's far higher than the levels agreed to in the 2015 nuclear deal, but lower than the purity used to make a nuclear weapon. President Trump brought the United States out of that nuclear deal back in 2018. Iran confirmed its enrichment plans Monday, the same day the country seized a South Korean-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. The moves come almost exactly 1 year after U.S. forces killed top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Reva Goujon is head of strategic intelligence at Martin+Crumpton Group, a global strategic advisory firm, and she joins me now from Austin, Texas. Thanks very much for being with us. You call this an escalate to de-escalate negotiating strategy on the part of Iran. What does that mean? And talk more about the timing of this announcement.
Sure. Even without the anniversary of the assassination of General Soleimani, even without the assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist, Iran arguably needed to engineer a nuclear crisis to time with the U.S. presidential transition. And the reason for that is primarily economic. If you just look at where Iran stands today, given the maximum sanctions pressure campaign, it's exporting well below even the 1.5 million barrels per day it was exporting back in 2012, which when you saw big multilateral sanctions that eventually drove Iran to negotiate. So the economic pressure is severe. Inflation risks are real. The social unrest risk is very real for the regime that's worried about that broader instability. And so Iran still faces this overwhelming imperative to negotiate. So the question is, how does it shape the negotiation? And this is where you see the 20% enrichment announcement, right? It's keeping it scoped to the nuclear issue. These are all reversible moves, but the timeline here becomes very critical to reach some kind of compliance for compliance limited deal. And, Iran can show that it's retaliating for these assassinations, but there's a line that it needs to stay within to ensure that it doesn't actually derail at least that limited negotiation to get sanctions relief, which is a very real prospect now that we have Biden coming into the White House.
So given what you just spelled out, Reva, how is the Trump administration responding to these provocations?
Well, we've seen some mixed messages. There's been a bit of a chaotic response out of the Pentagon, and we saw first, a kind of a de-escalatory signal with the USS Nimitz returning home and then remaining in theater. So the military posturing is still there, of course. The president has been very clear that he will hold Iran accountable for any attacks on its forces, whether by militant proxies or not. So we could see a flare-up, just like we saw in reaction to the assassination of Soleimani, where we saw Iran actually launch a missile attack against a base in Iraq where U.S. forces were concentrated. That still was a managed response. It didn't lead to a bigger escalation. You could see something similar, but what's critical here is the nuclear escalation, because Iran is very intentionally reducing that breakout time. And that is what is forcing a crisis and thus a negotiation to de-escalate, hence the escalate to de-escalate strategy.
Well, President-elect Joe Biden has pledged to reinstate the 2015 nuclear agreement. What's changed between then and now? And how do you anticipate Iran-U.S. relations changing under the Biden administration?
Well, the key challenge for the Biden administration is to scope the agreement, this limited negotiation. So, we've already seen Jake Sullivan, President-elect Biden, talking about a compliance for compliance deal, in which Iran returns to compliance on reaching those nuclear enrichment levels, again, back to the JCPOA terms. And the U.S. would issue sanctions waivers. Even if it can't immediately lift sanctions, it could stop enforcing the maximum pressure sanctions, allow Iran to regain its oil output over time. And so that is, by definition, a very limited deal. It's, if the term hasn't been abused enough by the Chinese trade negotiations, it's kind of a phase one deal. And what the Biden team is trying to do is assure Israel, Saudi Arabia, members of Congress, the UAE, all the major stakeholders that there will be a phase two, so to speak, that a deal will encompass the ballistic missile program, the sunset clauses in the original JCPOA, ratification for Iran of the additional protocol to ensure those inspections remain in place. But that is going to be very difficult to achieve. I think prospects for that phase two broader agreement are very low, especially given Iranian distrust of U.S. intentions. And Iran has to also wonder what will happen in 2024. If there's another, if we see another transition in the presidency, that could lead to more uncertainty in U.S. policy toward Iran. So they will be hedging their bets very carefully.
Yeah, and very quickly, with just over 2 weeks left in the Trump presidency, what are you going to be watching out for in the next phase of potential negotiations?
Some really key things to watch is, one, is the assumption that Iran has that the U.S. doesn't want to get into a military conflict with Iran this late in the game with just a couple weeks left in the Trump presidency. Does it really want to avoid a military conflict? Or could the president maybe benefit from a distraction with a military escalation with Iran? That's a big assumption Iran is making. So whether this leads to a military escalation. We also have to see, watch Iranian internal discord within the elite. There's a lot of tussling over policy right now and shaping the terms of the negotiation. We'll have to see, does Iran actually curtail access to inspectors? They have certainly threatened to do so. But that would be a very high-risk maneuver. If you reduce transparency into the nuclear program at the same time, you are escalating tensions significantly. I would also watch Russia. Russia's preparing for a big negotiation with the United States, with New START coming online and needing to renegotiate that arms treaty now in the wake of this major cyber breach, which is now working to Moscow's advantage. And Russia always looks to Iran as very useful tool to either play the spoiler or the facilitator when it needs to negotiate with the United States on broader issues. So we'll need to watch Moscow very carefully as well.
Incredibly high geopolitical stakes. All right, Reva Goujon, thank you very much, Reva, for your time. Really appreciate it.